You Don't Know Flack. You Don't Know Flack.
Welcome to You Don't Know Flack, a podcast full of stories about retro gaming, retro computing, video games, arcade games, and technology from a guy who was there and still is. My name is Rob O'Hara, but for the next 30 minutes, you can call me Flack.
Episode 122. MAME Cabinets.
Hello and welcome to episode 122 of You Don't Know Flack. Today is Sunday, February 3rd, 2013, and I am your host, Rob Flack O'Hara. On today's show, I'll be talking about MAME Cabinets. I'll explain what MAME is, what MAME Cabinets are, and tell you everything you need to know about building one. This has been one of the most highly requested topics since I started the podcast all the way back in 2008, so I hope everyone enjoys this show. I decided to try something new this week by having background music run during the show's opening segment. The song you are now listening to is Chartreuse Cactus from the album I Cactus. Let me know what you think about this new twist by emailing me at robohara@robohara.com or by calling the You Don't Know Flack voicemail box at area code 206-309-9501. This is the part of the show where I will read feedback and play voicemail messages I've received throughout the week. So let's go ahead and check that mailbox. Nothing there. Well, let's check the voicemail line.
You have 0 messages.
Well, that segment ended quickly. If you'd like to have your letters read on the podcast or your voicemail messages played back, go ahead and send me an email at robohara@robohara.com or call the voicemail line. I'd like to welcome all of our new podcast affiliates this week. Since day one, the show has been available on the website, which is podcast.robohara.com, or through iTunes. But over the last week and a half, I got the show added to Stitcher, which is a really cool mobile app for streaming podcasts, and the Xbox Marketplace, which is formerly the Zune Marketplace. The show is also now available through Double Twist and Podcast Pickle. So no matter where you get the new episodes, thank you for listening. Episode 122 also brings the show its first sponsor. Episode 122 was sponsored in part by full-time freelance writer Brett Weiss, author of the award-winning Classic Home Video Games book series. The ambitious goal of the Classic Home Video Games book series is to catalog, describe, and review every game for every classic video game console, including such favorites as the Atari 2600, Intellivision, NES, and Sega Genesis. You can order books in the Classic Home Video Game series through Amazon or through Brett's website, which is www.brettweisswords.com. I've met Brett several times at the Oklahoma Video Game Expos that take place in Tulsa each year, and he's always interesting to talk to, so be sure to check his books out. Thank you, Brett, for being the first official sponsor of the show. If you would like to sponsor an episode of You Don't Know Flack, you can find the information at the top of the website. I hope you guys don't maim me for having such a long introduction. Hey, speaking of MAME, let's get started with episode 122, MAME Cabinets. The first time I saw emulation was around the time I got Windows 95. A couple of Nintendo NES emulators were released around that time, and to be honest with you, to me at that time, emulation seemed more like a parlor trick. It was like a magic trick. Hey, look, we got Nintendo games to run on a PC. So at that time, I didn't think of emulation as being what it is today, of course, like a way to play games or anything like that. I just, like I said, it seemed more like a trick, like something you could do, like when somebody ports something over to an iPod or whatever. Like, I saw a text adventure engine running on an iPod Nano with a screen so small there's no way you could read the text. So it's more of a technical demo than anything that would be applicable. So that's was my first impressions of emulation. The idea of emulation is a little bit backwards than what we'd had up until that point. We had arcade games like Pac-Man, let's say, and then when you had a home system, someone would look at the arcade game and try to capture the look and feel of the arcade game, but rewrite it completely for a new host system, like the Atari 2600. Obviously, you can't take what was doing in the arcade, the code that was running, and convert that over into something the Atari 2600 would run. The technical limitations were just too great. So what you would do, or what programmers would do, is look at the code, look at the game in the arcade, take the essence of it, and then go rewrite it for a different system. So emulation is kind of the reverse of that. Instead of rewriting code to run on a new system, what you write on a system is software that emulates the hardware that the host software runs on. So in other words, for Pac-Man, for example, if you want to emulate Pac-Man on a PC, you're not rewriting the arcade code of Pac-Man. What you write is code that emulates the hardware. And then you take the original software of the Pac-Man arcade game and dump the information off of the actual ROMs and put that in a system to where the emulator can actually read them. So MAME actually got its start as being a Pac-Man emulator, and I remember downloading this and running it at the time, and I remember thinking how hilarious it was that you had to press a button to insert coins into this game that was on my computer. Which, if you think about it, that's exactly how the arcade game works. You have to put coins or a quarter or a token into the game to trigger the game to know that you have credits that you can start playing the game. So when you take that original code and move it over to a PC, unless you change the code, you still have to tell the software that you've put a quarter into it, even though the code itself doesn't know that it's running on a PC. It just knows that it's running the original code. So MAME did get its start as a Pac-Man emulator. Other games began being added to this emulator, and then pretty soon it was rechristened as MAME, which stands for Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator. So the idea of MAME is that it's one program that emulates all these different types of hardware. And then what people do is they take, the term is PCB, printed circuit board. Think of it like a motherboard that's inside your computer. In arcade games, you have a PCB that has a whole bunch of different chips on it, ROM chips, read-only memory, right? And so people take these chips and dump them into a format that MAME can read. So the idea of MAME is that you have one program that can play a lot of different arcade games. Now, back in the day, when MAME first started, it could play a couple of hundred arcade games, but now it can play thousands and thousands of different arcade games. So all the classic games, all your favorite games from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even a lot of modern games, MAME can faithfully reproduce on your home computer. So I think we would all agree that playing arcade games on your home computer is different than playing them in the arcade. First of all, if you think back to the early days of MAME, MAME officially came out in 1997. So I was a PC user back in 1997. So a lot of people that I knew that had PCs didn't even have joysticks. Most PCs back then didn't come with a joystick port. If it did, it was not a joystick port like what we think of today. It was a 15-pin game port that also doubled as a MIDI port. Even if you did have a sound card, usually the port came bundled on sound cards. But if you had a sound card that had that port and a joystick that plugged into it, you still had to make sure that games supported it, because not every game supported joysticks. And even when they did, early IBM joysticks were terrible. Now later they got better. I had a Gravis gamepad, which was the first joystick I ever saw that actually looked, it was shaped like a Super Nintendo control pad, but it had a D-pad on it instead of a joystick, and it had 4 buttons on the right-hand side. But to be honest with you, I don't remember playing MAME with that. For a long time, I played MAME using the PC keyboard. So, yeah, playing games, arcade games, even older ones like Pac-Man or Donkey Kong, are not exactly the same when you're playing them with a keyboard versus playing them with a joystick, or especially an arcade-type joystick. I remember, back then, Windows 95, 98, this was pre-USB, so it took a little bit of work to actually get joysticks working. Also, those old versions of MAME were DOS only, so that meant you had to figure out the command lines. It wasn't just running MAME and then putting the machine in. There were all these different little settings you had to put in there. So it took a little bit of work to get MAME up and running back then. Now, of course, MAME has just continued to grow. It's been ported over to pretty much every operating system and device I can think of. And when I say every, I don't just mean like Windows and Linux and Macs. It's on the iPhone. It's on the Sony PSP. MAME's been ported to the original Xbox. It's on the Wii. It's on the Amiga. You can get MAME on your Amiga. So, I mean, if your refrigerator has a processor or something, you can probably get MAME to run on that. And then, like I said, from the early days, MAME only supported maybe a couple hundred games, but now it's just in the thousands, well over 5,000, I believe, right now. So, but yeah, it's not, no matter what you're playing it on, it's not the same as playing it on an arcade machine. Like I said, the controls are not the same. When you're on an arcade cabinet, you have that arcade joystick, you have the buttons, you have that experience, of putting a quarter in and just standing in front of a machine, playing head-to-head against a friend or taking turns, I guess at some point, and I tried to look this up, I really couldn't find this, but probably, and it's one of those things that probably multiple people came up with the same idea at the same time, but this idea, I think a lot of people have this idea. The first time they see MAME, you have this idea of, well, what if you could put this in an arcade cabinet? And so that's, at the bare minimum, what a MAME cabinet is. It's taking a PC that plays MAME and putting it inside an arcade cabinet. Now, before we begin talking about MAME cabinets, I want to do a quick experiment. I want you to close your eyes for 10 seconds and imagine what a MAME cabinet would look like. Now, remember, we're talking about a computer that runs MAME inside an arcade cabinet. So close your eyes for 10 seconds and imagine what that would look like. Okay, so what did you imagine? I imagined an old pole position cabinet, a sit-down cabinet with MAME running inside that only runs driving games. Now that's probably not what you imagined. Maybe you imagined a machine that looked exactly like a real arcade game. Or maybe you imagine one of those giant MAME cabinets with a huge control panel, 4 joysticks, 8 buttons for every player, and trackball. Maybe you imagine a cocktail cabinet or something even completely different. It doesn't really matter. But the point of this exercise is twofold. And the first is that a MAME cabinet can look like anything you want it to look like. The other point is, before you run out and spend a bunch of money on parts and things for your MAME cabinet, you should really sit down and spend a few minutes to decide what you want your MAME cabinet to look like. Do you want it to look, I call it stealth machines. Do you want it to look like a normal arcade cabinet? Do you want it to have every control for every single game ever made? Or do you want to build something like that driving cabinet, something that specializes in playing one particular type of game? So let's talk in general about the parts of a MAME cabinet. You'll need a computer, of course, to run MAME, and a monitor. We'll need a cabinet to hold both of those things, and on that cabinet we're going to need some joysticks and buttons and a way to wire those things into the computer. And then ultimately we'll need some artwork. We'll need bezels and control panels and marquees and things like that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the computer. And it's funny, in my show notes here, that the computer is probably the most important thing inside the cabinet, but it's the thing I wrote the least about, because really there are so many different options. There's no one thing I can say, well, buy, this model of Dell computer and boom, MAME machine. It doesn't really work like that. So the first thing you need to decide is what do you want to play on your main machine? Like, what era of games? And the reason why that's important is because that will decide how powerful of a processor you need in your MAME cabinet. One thing to keep in mind is that MAME uses the CPU for all of its processing. It does not really use or take advantage of high-powered video cards. So really, if you need more speed, you're not going to upgrade video cards for a MAME cabinet. What you're going to do is get either more RAM or faster processor. I have seen MAME cabinets running on 486 computers. Now, granted, that's going to definitely limit what you can play. But old Pentiums, the MAME cabinet that I had running for years ran off a 1 gigahertz machine with, I think, 1 gig of RAM. As far as operating systems go, I'm a Microsoft guy, so you can set up a MAME cabinet to run DOS. I ran MAME on an XP machine and a Windows 2000 machine for a long time. A lot of the processing power may go to the operating system, which is overhead. So if you want to run Windows 7, let's say, on a MAME cabinet, you can obviously do that, but you're going to need a lot beefier processor just because it's Windows 7 versus XP or even, like I said, I ran a cabinet off of Windows 2000 for a long time. So, but there are lots of MAME builds out there for Linux. There's in fact I believe it's a Knoppix build that you can find. If I can find a link to that, I'll put it in the show notes. But it's basically a MAME system ready to go off of a CD. You could just put that in your machine, boot up off the CD, and have MAME ready to go. But there are Mac builds, there are DOS builds, anything that you want, to run MAME on. So again, it all ties together to how much processing power you'll need, to what operating system, things like that. You're also going to need a lot of drive space depending on how many ROMs you have on there. Each ROM in itself, each game ROM, is usually pretty small, but when you start collecting hundreds or thousands or 5,000 of these things, they can take up gigs and gigs and gigs of storage. So if you plan on having a MAME cabinet that has every game known to man on it, you're going to need quite a bit of storage. Throughout the years, MAME has begun to support CHD files, which are hard drive images that are used in some games, and there are also emulators to run Laserdisc games. I'll talk a little bit about that, but those things will really start to eat hard drive space. So if you're looking at those things, you'll definitely want to invest in a larger hard drive. So a couple of things I learned the hard way with my first MAME cabinet. When I built my first MAME cabinet, I wanted the inside of the cabinet to look as close to an arcade machine as possible, and I didn't think that having a PC sitting inside an arcade cabinet, even though you can't see it from the front, but I knew it was there, and I didn't want just to have a PC sitting inside there. So I completely disassembled a PC, and I took the motherboard out and mounted it to the wood, and I took the hard drive out, and I put it on little rails, and I mounted it, and it looked much less like a PC inside an arcade cabinet, and it looked fairly authentic like an arcade cabinet. The problem was every time I had to work on it, I was on my hands and knees behind this arcade cabinet digging around for things because I couldn't just remove the PC. Something that MAME doesn't use at all is a network connection. Basically, MAME does not need a network connection to operate, but inevitably, the machine that you have running MAME will need upgrades. It will need repair. You'll want to change things. You'll want to tweak things. You may want to add games or remove games or whatever. So by taking the machine apart and mounting it to the wood was not really the best design, I don't think, in retrospect. Now, one thing a lot of people do is if you have a network connection or now wireless, you can just add a wireless NIC to the back of that machine, and then using a remote desktop, some sort of remote tools. I use VNC, whatever you want to use, but you can remote into the machine, upgrade it remotely without having to actually get inside the machine. It's also a good idea to, especially until you're done, to have an easy way to add a keyboard and mouse to the machine. This is another issue I had because the cabinet I used, there was no good front access. So I was constantly running around to the back of the machine and trying to do things where I couldn't see the monitor, and I even had a mirror set up at one time where it was a horrible setup. So, yeah, I would probably, if I were building a new MAME cabinet today, I would just take the tower, whatever computer tower you plan on using, and put it in the bottom of the cabinet and call it a day for that. But definitely think about how you're going to upgrade that machine in the future. I would recommend, wireless NICs are so inexpensive these days. I would probably just buy a wireless network card, attach it to the back, and then that way I could remote in and do that. But now, connected to that computer, you're going to need a monitor, and there are several different options on monitors for MAME cabinets. You can use an authentic arcade monitor. You can use an old CRT computer style monitor. You can use a newer LCD style monitor, or you can actually use a television. So let's talk about the pros and cons of each one of those. First of all, an arcade monitor is going to give you the most authentic experience. Arcade monitors have a different look and feel and resolution than all the other solutions. So anybody who has been around arcade games will instantly notice if you're playing Pac-Man on an LCD screen versus an original monitor. It just doesn't look the same. So if you want to do that, there are cards that you can buy that will output. Arcade monitors use a different refresh rate than normal monitors, than computer monitors do. So you can't just plug an arcade monitor into your PC without having a special card. So they do sell those cards, and if that's the way that you want to go. Now, running Windows or anything like that on an arcade monitor is going to prove to be difficult. But if you want to just, basically what you would do is use it as a second output. You output MAME to that second video card and run off of that. Now, the downsides of arcade monitors, first of all, essentially at this point, they don't make new arcade monitors. Arcade monitors are, mostly what you're going to get now are old ones that may or may not need repair. They may need cap kits. They're going to be difficult for the average person to work on. They can be dangerous to work on. If I were building a MAME cabinet from scratch today, I would not recommend that you go buy an arcade monitor. Now, if you are retrofitting an old arcade cabinet, and I'll talk a little bit about that, then you might want to look into that. But a lot of people, the first thing they do is they pull the arcade monitor out, sell it, reuse it for something else, and they replace it with a different option. So a second option would be a CRT computer monitor, an old tube computer monitor, the kind that many of us listening to this grew up with versus what we have now. This is actually, as far as accuracy goes, as far as looking authentic, let's say, it's one of the worst solutions. The other one is the LCD solution. And the reason is because they look too good. They are too crisp. Resolutions on these monitors are designed for operating systems, for text, for things like that. So when you put an arcade game on it, if you look at the graphics of, let's say, Donkey Kong, like the actual character Donkey Kong, when you look at him on a computer monitor, it's very crisp and very detailed, and you can see exactly which colors they used. But if you look at Donkey Kong on an arcade monitor, because of the resolution, because of the technology, those colors, the edges, they kind of blend together. They could make colors, they depended on that to make the edges not seem so harsh and to make colors blend together a little better. So on a computer monitor, a CRT monitor, let's say, it ruins that illusion. It's too clear. It's like putting a spotlight on a magician who's on stage. It just brings out all these details that you really don't want to see. So those are the easiest solutions. Now, I'll tell you a problem, and this is, I was going to talk about this later, but this seems like a better place for it here. One of the biggest problems that we used to see with MAME cabinets is that people would use their old CRT that they had laying around in their garage. You know, we all had these old tube monitors, and nobody wants to throw them away. You can't give them away. I have taken computer monitors to Goodwill, and they won't take them. So we all have these old computer monitors sitting around in our garages, or at least I did. When people are building a MAME cabinet, they say, "Hey, I have this monitor," you know, and so they go dig these monitors out, and they're maybe 15-inch monitors or 17-inch monitors, something like that. And they put them in the MAME cabinet, and if you look at pictures of people who have done this, it looks ridiculous because the monitor is so undersized compared to an arcade monitor. Most arcade machines had 19-inch monitors or 25-inch monitors, and so if you put a 15-inch PC monitor in a MAME cabinet, it just looks stupid. You know, people put these giant bezels all the way around the monitor to try to hide the fact that it's a tiny little monitor. But I don't know why. I mean, people invest all this time and all this effort into building a MAME cabinet, and then they put a tiny monitor right in the middle of it. It looks terrible. That's my opinion. So anyway, like I touched on, you could also go with, you know, like a modern LCD monitor. But even then, you know, like I said, it's so crisp. A lot of this has to do with all of this MAME cabinets has to do with what you want and what's important to you. If you look at MAME on an LCD monitor and you think it looks great, then put one in there. You know, there's no rules to building a MAME cabinet. Now, there will be, and I'm going to talk more about this later, but there will be a long line of people waiting to tell you how you did everything wrong. I don't know why the MAME community is that way, but it is. But so if you grew up playing arcade games, and if you have other arcade machines, that a MAME cabinet with an LCD monitor is going to stand out like a sore thumb. But if it doesn't bother you, do it. Now, the best solution I have found personally is using a television set. And television sets, I think, are the best of both worlds because they use the older technology like old computer or like old arcade monitors. They have that, you know, they're not quite as crisp. They have that same type of look to them. But they can also be very simple to hook up to a computer if your computer has an S-video out port. So my MAME cabinet, this is what I ended up doing. At first I had a CRT monitor in there, and like I said, I just ultimately I wasn't happy with the way that it looked. So I found a television that had a S-video input, and I had a TV card or a TV out card that had S-video out. So when you plug it in, you immediately get that original look of an arcade monitor, but it's very simple to hook up. So, and the good thing about TVs right now, and I think we're going to have to hurry because they're slowly disappearing, but, you know, when I go to pawn shops or thrift stores, you'll see televisions that will work for this for $10 or $20, you know, so it's really a cheap money investment. Now, as far as I've seen people when they put, you know, computer monitors or whatever in their MAME cabinet, that they take the plastic off, they take the housing, they actually take the monitor itself out. You know, again, that's a matter of personal preference. If you ever plan on pulling that monitor back out and using it for something else, I don't recommend that. Sometimes you have to make modifications to, especially, I had a 21-inch computer monitor, a CRT monitor, and the case was so giant that it stuck out of the back of the arcade cabinet. So, I mean, in a case like that, you kind of got to do what you got to do. I mean, if you have to pull the cabinet off or the housing off, you know, whatever. But, again, a lot of this is just, I don't want to say winging it, but it is in a way. It's taking what you can get, what you want, and putting it into a cabinet. So speaking of cabinets, let's talk a little bit about that cabinet itself. Now, there are two trains of thought, I guess, when it comes to arcade cabinets for MAME machines. The first is there are people that build them from scratch. There are plans on the internet, and I will link to some of these in the show notes. There are plans that you can download for a Miss Pac-Man cabinet. or Defender cabinet or whatever, any retro, there are even generic ones if you don't really care about it looking like a specific type of machine. So, and there are plans that you can buy, but there are plenty out there that are available for free. So you could go download these plans, go buy some, wood from your local lumber shop and cut out an arcade cabinet. So now why would you want to do that? And the answer is because you have a brand new cabinet. I mean, nobody's ever kicked it. Nobody's ever scratched their initials into it. Nobody has ever, maybe you can't find one. Maybe you can't find a vintage arcade cabinet that's in good enough condition for you to use. So, there are lots of reasons why to make your own. Personally, I've never done that. It just seems like, first of all, I'm terrible when it comes to cutting wood. Like, I can cut, every time I build shelves, I'll cut 3 pieces of wood, and somehow they're all different lengths. I don't know how I do that. So, if you are good at woodworking or you know somebody who is and you want to do that, then that's certainly a possibility. But the route that I've always taken is the other route, which is refurbishing old arcade cabinets and turning them into MAME machines. Now, let's have a talk about that, because if you do this, people will have a talk with you about this. So, there are 2 types of arcade cabinets. And to put it very simply, there are arcade cabinets that people give a crap about, and there are arcade cabinets that people don't give a crap about. My first MAME machine, and I wasn't part of the arcade community, arcade scene, whatever you want to call it at that time. My parents, when I was a kid, bought my sister an arcade game. It was a Sega game, but it had been converted, so it wasn't an original cabinet. And I knew the cabinet looked familiar as a kid. I didn't know as much about arcade cabinets then as I know now. But the game died, and then when I started collecting actual arcade machines, this cabinet had been sitting in a back bedroom with stuff piled on it, and so my dad said I could have it. So this arcade cabinet was actually a Donkey Kong Jr. Nintendo cabinet. It was orange with the white T molding, and on the back it even had a little plaque from Nintendo identifying it as a Donkey Kong Jr. cabinet. The game didn't work. There were no parts inside it that worked. The monitor had died. The motherboard still worked, but when the power supply died, that was it. There were no parts inside this, essentially, that worked. So I thought, hey, I'll just turn this into a MAME cabinet. So I worked for a long time turning this into a MAME cabinet. I told you, I disassembled a PC, I mounted it in there, I got all my wiring done, I got everything done. I had a custom marquee printed up. I did everything. And when I posted pictures of this on the internet, people went crazy, and not in a good way. I got an email from people calling me a piece of crap. I mean, people were like, how dare you desecrate a Donkey Kong Jr. cabinet and turn it into a crappy MAME cabinet. Now, I knew the backstory. I mean, I knew that this was a non-working cabinet, and I actually hadn't done anything to the cabinet itself. I hadn't changed anything. I didn't saw anything off or, take apart any original parts or anything like that. So I really didn't understand people's ire towards me at that time, but now I do get it a little bit, and it's because there are so many generic cabinets that were made over the years. Dynamo was a company that just made arcade cabinets that were generic, so you would buy this cabinet and then put whatever you wanted in it. Or there were machines that had just been, year after year that were reused, that weren't memorable, for lack of a better word. They weren't identifiable. They were just generic cabinets. And so if you're going to use an arcade cabinet, I'm not telling you what you have to use. You can go buy a vintage whatever, Dragon's Lair machine, something that's completely unique, and then you can strip everything off of it and make it the MAME 1000, whatever. It doesn't matter. But what I am telling you is that there are people that will attack you for doing that. And so as part of a community, as part of the arcade community, what I would tell you is if you have a cabinet or you acquire a cabinet that's something like that, you might throw it out there. Somebody might trade you for a better cabinet. I mean, a lot of people would rather see, when I had spare cabinets around or whatever, I would have traded somebody a good generic one for a bad Donkey Kong cabinet because, a known cabinet like that, if somebody gets a Donkey Kong cabinet, what they're probably going to do is restore it and turn it back into a Donkey Kong machine, whereas a generic cabinet nobody cares about. So anyway, that's just a little bit about the types of cabinets. So Chris Kohler from Wired.com wrote a book called Retro Gaming Hacks several years ago, and it was a compilation of articles, and he was looking for people to write articles. So I submitted articles about building MAME machines, and I included pictures of my MAME machine, which was a Donkey Kong Jr. MAME cabinet. And let me tell you, I did get email about that. I won't say death threats, but it felt like it at the time. When you put all your work into something and somebody's like, wow, what a jerk you are, So, it's just something to keep in mind. But at the bottom line, who cares? I've had this conversation. I'm kind of derailing now at this point, but I've had this conversation in comparing MAME cabinets to classic cars because my dad does not care about arcade cabinets in the way that I do. I mean, he understands, why I enjoy them and why I collected them. So as I'm trying to relate to him why people are upset about me turning a Donkey Kong Jr. cabinet into a MAME machine, he's like, well, who cares? Who cares what they do, And so I'm like, okay, well, let's say you bought a 57 Chevy and you decided, and it was working, it was running car, a highly collectible car, and you took it and basically pulled the body off and threw the car away, and you put the body on your lawnmower, and so now you have a riding lawnmower that looks like a 57 Chevy, and then he gets it, and there are a lot of parallels between classic car restoration, doing things like that, and MAME cabinets, So if you're looking for a generic body that doesn't matter for your riding lawnmower, maybe you should get a 74 Pinto or something like that, something that collectors aren't looking for. Bottom line, if you've got the money, you buy a 57 Chevy and you can do whatever you want to with it. But just don't expect a lot of support from the community when you show off pictures of that. I learned that the hard way. So anyway, back to the actual cabinet. If you build a cabinet, I have seen people, there's a website I just found while I was doing a little bit of research for this show, of a guy who built his own MAME cabinet basically over a weekend. I mean, he got the plans, he already had a table saw, and he had all the tools and stuff. Obviously, he's skilled in woodworking, and he built a MAME cabinet over a weekend. That's not typical. Most of us don't have those skills. I don't have those skills. So anytime I thought about doing a MAME cabinet, I would look at, getting a cabinet, acquiring an older cabinet that I would turn it into a MAME machine. But the first thing you want to look at is how much work is this cabinet going to require? The classic arcade Cactus Jack's, which is located just a few miles from me, used to put their old machines out by the curb. So you would drive by this arcade maybe once a month, maybe once every couple of months, and there would be arcade machines out by the curb. So like classic cars, since I already started that comparison, you could look at these cabinets, and when you see an old Asteroids cabinet, especially if you grew up playing Asteroids, you're like, oh my god, it's an Asteroids machine. But what you're probably not seeing with your eyes, you're seeing it with your heart, and you're seeing it with your memories. But with your eyes, what you're not seeing is maybe this cabinet has water damage. And water damage, most old arcade games were built out of MDF, which is basically little specks of wood that have been glued together. And when they get wet, it acts like a sponge. It expands and turns the wood into mush that will break off with just the slightest touch. And it's a mess. And it's not repairable. Now, I mean, it's repairable in the sense that you can cut the damaged part off and then try to, join up wood or whatever to extend the cabinet. It's a lot of work. So, when you're looking at old cabinets to turn into MAME cabinets, you have to look with your eyes. Don't look with your heart. Because, like I said, it's easy to see, just like with cars. You see an old Trans Am or something, and you say, oh, and you're thinking, what could this car be, but not what it is. You don't see that it has 4 flat tires and it hasn't been started in 20 years. You just see, maybe you have memories of that car as a kid, or you see what it could be, So, now, I have gone to arcade auctions. I had a podcast about arcade auctions. And non-working machines and empty cabinets are usually moved towards the end of the auction. And I have bought arcade cabinets in decent condition for $5. I've bought non-working machines in really good condition for $25. So those are great candidates for MAME machines. I mean, you have an entire machine. You have everything you need inside. If you wanted to use the original joysticks and buttons on those machines, there you go. So it's a really good head start. Those are good places. Also, sniff around at the local arcade. If you still have a local arcade, maybe they have machines that are broken or in the back. There is a relationship that a lot of people don't understand. When you are looking for an arcade cabinet, it is like gold that you're looking for. You're looking for something very valuable. But on the flip side, people that run arcades, especially several years ago, maybe not so much now, but, they might have machines that they can't get rid of. I mean, if you think about getting rid of an arcade machine, you're talking about having to beat it apart with a sledgehammer or cut it apart with a saw and get it into a trash dumpster. It's a time investment. It's a time and energy investment. So you might actually be doing them a favor by picking up an old broken machine and hauling it off for free, So there is that synergy, that little relationship that exists. They may actually have things they're wanting to get rid of, and you could be doing them a favor. I wouldn't necessarily approach it. Don't show up and say, hey, I'm willing to do you a favor by hauling off this machine. But sniff around, they may be able... one thing that anybody who's ever dealt with arcade vendors knows is that arcade vendors are about money. So, if you offer to haul off a broken game for $20 or something, that's a good deal to them. That's, you're saving them time and money. So, but that's one good place to acquire old arcade cabinets. Now, once you've got an arcade cabinet, one thing to consider is how are you going to finish it? And I don't know where this case... I think this is a case of people having faulty memories. But I've seen a lot of people building MAME cabinets get almost obsessed with trying to get a mirror finish on the side of a cabinet using paint. And I think it's because in their mind, they're not remembering arcade cabinets correctly. Now, there are many different kinds of finish that were on arcade games. And if you look at older games... several of the older games that I had, like Scramble, were simply plywood on the outside. Or if you look at a Defender cabinet, the old cabinets like that, Defender cabinet is plywood. I've taken one apart, and I can tell you it's definitely plywood. And on the outside it was painted. And then on those games, those two specific games, Scramble and Defender, Miss Pac-Man's another one, the graphics were simply spray-painted stencils that were applied to the outside of the machine. The other type of finish that became popular later was Formica. And Formica, if you've never worked with it, is a god-awful pain in the ass if you don't have the right tools. If you have the right tools, it's not really an issue. But Formica breaks very easily, so if you don't know what you're doing, it's very easy to buy a sheet of 4x8 Formica, come home to stick it on the side of an arcade cabinet, and then immediately bust it and have $20 go down the drain just like that. So the easiest way to apply Formica to to the side of a cabinet is to use a router with the right bit. There are bits that will trim Formica, and you can simply glue Formica to the side of an arcade cabinet and then trim around it and have it fit exactly. But so those are really the two most common finishes. There were, painted cabinets, which were painted wood, and there was Formica. So I see a lot of people that build MAME cabinets spend an awful lot of time and money trying to get wood to look like Formica. And you can do it. You're going to spend a lot of time primering and painting and sanding and repainting and sanding and repainting. Again, this goes back to something I already said. It's whatever you want to do. There's no right or wrong way to build a MAME cabinet. So it's whatever you're going after. But, before you spend a ton of money and time at trying to, get a, paint on a sheet of wood or to be able to show your own reflection in, take a look at other arcade cabinets, real cabinets. And I think what you'll find is you won't find very many that look like that. Now, a friend of mine, Bricktop, who actually runs an arcade forum on Facebook, for a while was making cabinets using a custom glitter paint. And yeah, I thought it looked fantastic. I think what he was shooting for is, it's almost like a retro 70s. I know he had one that was a silver sparkly and one that was pink, I think. And I thought they looked great. They don't really sell. It doesn't appeal, I don't think, to arcade truists, if you will, but to people that are looking to put a game in their den or something, I thought they looked really good. So, but again, it's just your imagination. You can make a MAME cabinet looks exactly like a retro arcade cabinet, or you can put whatever you want on there. To give you an example on mine, the one I was talking about, that was the Donkey Kong Jr. cabinet. I grew up hanging out at a local arcade named Cactus Jack's. So when it was time to put my own MAME machine together, I used Photoshop and I made my own marquee to go across the top. And I found a picture of a desert with a single cactus on there, and mine was Cactus Flax. And so it was just a little, mine was unique. It was different from everyone else's, but it was just something that I enjoyed, that I thought was pretty cool. So now the front part of the cabinet that holds the controls, the joystick and the button, is called the control panel. And depending on how many controls, how many joysticks and buttons and things like that you want to put on your arcade cabinet, that might determine what kind of cabinet you end up buying. Now, I have always thought there's a balance. There is a balance here. If you put like a normal arcade cabinet that has 2 joysticks and 3 buttons, let's say, per player, that's enough to play a lot of games. You can play a lot of arcade games with 2 joysticks and 3 buttons. Or 3 buttons per player, I should say. So some people want 4-player cabinets. And so you start to see these control panels grow. Now there were some 4-player games, obviously, Simpsons and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and things like that, Gauntlet, are very well-known 4-player games. But each one of those games usually only had a couple of buttons per player. So the trap, let's call it a trap, that people fall into is this. I'm only going to build one MAME cabinet, and I want that cabinet to play as many different games as possible. So what that leads to is the mentality that you have to have as many joysticks and as many buttons and as many features all on one single control panel as possible. And there are websites actually dedicated to terrible looking MAME machines. There's one called Crap MAME. There's another called, I think it's more of a general term now, is called a Franken MAME or Franken cabinet. But it's like these people that throw every single thing onto the machine. Now, I've already said this several times. I guess I'm going to keep saying it. It's your cabinet. you can put whatever you want. If you want to put 52 buttons on a control panel, then go buy 52 buttons. Start drilling holes. But if you want it to look sort of like a real arcade game or a real arcade cabinet, you'll notice you don't see control panels like that. Now, the Donkey Kong cabinet that I had, or Donkey Kong Jr. cabinet that I had, space is pretty limited on that control panel. In fact, I only had 2 buttons per player and 2 joysticks. I think the joysticks on mine had been upgraded to like a Versus cabinet, like an Excitebike type cabinet or something, where you had 2 joysticks. But there are a lot of different ideologies about how to approach the control panel. One thing to consider are your joysticks. There were classic games that used 2-way sticks. Space Invaders used a 2-way stick. Actually, Space Invaders, I think, just used buttons. Joust uses a 2-way stick, and I think Defender uses a 2-way stick. Those are joysticks that are limited, physically limited, to only going 2 directions. Then there are 4-way sticks. Games like Pac-Man used a 4-way stick where you could only go in 4 directions. And then there were 8-way sticks. Games that were designed to let you go diagonal as well. Games like Mortal Kombat, things like that. And then there are, of course, other specialty joysticks. I think the Cinestar has a 49-way joystick. So, but basically, the problem with MAME cabinets is the difference between 4-way and 8-way sticks. And that problem is that games that use 8-way controls don't work well if you're using a 4-way stick. And vice versa, games that were designed for a 4-way stick don't work well when you're using an 8-way joystick. If you try to play Pac-Man, or Donkey Kong's a great example. If you try to play Donkey Kong with an 8-way stick, what you'll find is a barrel of frustration. I didn't write that, I just made that up. But what you'll find, though, is if you've ever played a game and you're like Donkey Kong, and you go up the ladder and then it's like you're stuck, like you can't get off the ladder, and it's because you're not really pressing left, you're pressing up and left on an 8-way joystick, and the game doesn't recognize that. It doesn't know what to do because it wasn't programmed to know what to happen when you press 2 directions at the same time, because with a 4-way stick that's not possible. So it's very frustrating to play an old game that was designed to use a 4-way stick on if you're using an 8-way stick. And the same is true going the other way. It's very hard to hit diagonals on games with a 4-way stick. So now there are multiple ways to tackle this issue, and one is if you have a giant control panel and you have every control method known to man on your control panel, then what people do is they will add a dedicated 4-way stick. Now, most older games that used a 4-way stick like that were only one-player games. Games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and Frogger. Only one person uses the joystick at a time, so most people only put, if they're going to do it this way, if they're going to... this solution is they would put one 4-way stick on the control panel, and then they have 2 or 4 8-way sticks also on there for other players. So it does get around that problem of playing 4-way games 4-way games with an 8-way stick and vice versa. But this control panel issue that we've been talking about is growing and growing. It's getting bigger. Now, the other solution is there are multiple joysticks on the market now that are easily switchable between 4-way and 8-way. There are some methods are easier than others. The simplest I've seen is Hap has a joystick that you can actually just pull the joystick up, rotate it, and push it back down. And when you do that, you change it from being a 4-way to an 8-way. There's also I have sticks on my old cabinet that have a slider bar where you can slide it and it's rotating a restrictor plate underneath the joystick to make it a 4-way or an 8-way. So it's just different ways to tackle the problem, but that is one thing to keep in mind. And another thing is, what are you going to play the most? If you're building a MAME machine to play fighting games, I would put 8-way sticks on there and then deal with, the problem of having 4-way games. And the opposite's true. If you are mostly a retro type gamer and you're wanting an old machine to play Moon Patrol and Joust and things like that on, then you might not need 8-way sticks. But if you are wanting to put something together that'll play both, then I would recommend looking at the joysticks that convert easily between 4-way and 8-way sticks. The other consideration is how many buttons are you going to put on your control panel. Now, JAMA arcade games basically support 3 buttons per player. Then you're also going to need a player 1 start and a player 2 start. So that's about 8 buttons. Fighting games can use up to 6 buttons. Neo Geo games use 4 buttons or up to 4 buttons. And then, like I said, fighting games often have 5 or 6 buttons. So, again, what are you going to play, and do you want to support every game? If you want to support every game, you need joysticks that switch between 4 and 8-way, and you need 6 buttons per person. Now, if you're only going to play retro games, something like that, then maybe you don't need all 6 buttons. Maybe you only need 2 or 3 buttons. I would say at a minimum, I would put 3 buttons per player because that's what JAMA supports. But if you want to support everything, yeah, then you may need 6 buttons per person. Again, part of this can be limited to how much real estate you actually have available on the control panel. And the other part is, it's your cabinet, so how much do you want to support? Now, in addition to joysticks and buttons, there are several other things that you can add. One thing is a trackball. They sell trackballs that wire into MAME cabinets. And trackballs are good for trackball games. If you've ever tried to play a trackball game with anything other than a trackball, you know how difficult that can be. So if you're looking to have Centipede or Millipede or Missile Command or Marble Madness, which is a great game, then you might want to think about adding a trackball. You can also add a spinner, and spinners are relatively easy to add to a cabinet. So if you want to play Tempest, if you want to play Tron is one of the biggest pain in the butts to set up for any kind of emulation. Because you have a joystick that has a fire button on it. You have to be able to use a joystick and fire with one hand and use a spinner with another hand. And very few arcade joysticks, especially ones that would be designed for a MAME cabinet, have a trigger on the joystick. So you could do it, but man, I mean, it's like you have to basically really want to play emulated Tron on your arcade cabinet to get Tron to work, to feel anything remotely like a Tron arcade game. So yeah, you can add spinners. Spinners also double for driving games.
Prepare to qualify.
It's the same type of technology, and you can set MAME up to recognize a spinner as a steering wheel as well for a driving game. And in fact, at the beginning of the show when I was talking about that pole position, I actually had a friend who set up a dedicated driving MAME cabinet. And that's exactly what he used, was a modified spinner with a steering wheel attached to it. And he just configured all these different games, driving type games in MAME. Now, when you start doing specialized MAME cabinets, you're going to start talking about dedicating some space to things. And this is coming from a guy who, up until recently owned 30 arcade cabinets. So I know about dedicating space to dumb hobbies. But yeah, if you think, well, if you could set up a vertical cabinet, versus a horizontal cabinet, or maybe a driving cabinet or whatever. So, with just a few cabinets, you could pretty much cover everything. Or, like I said, build that MAME cabinet that'll play everything. Another, I got to dig out the links. I just remembered this. Years ago, there was a guy who built a system. There's a couple of different people. I know somebody has built interchangeable control panels for MAME cabinets. Basically, it's just he would have one control panel for fighting games, one for retro games, things like that. And there's a system where they unplug and plug in. You could swap out different control panels very easily. So that's one solution. Another solution, and I've seen the guy that built this, but I don't know anybody else who has done it. But there was a guy who put together a rotating control panel, and so the actual control panel rotated. It was triangular shaped, and there were 3 different sets that had joysticks and buttons for different configurations. So I always thought that was super cool, but that's way beyond my my personal building skills. But so the control panel is something that you should really spend a lot of time with. It's funny how just a little thing will make a big difference. I mean, just by putting your buttons too close together or too far apart, or not lined up exactly straight, or even the colors, if they don't match the rest of your cabinet, it can really, that's what you're going to be looking at a lot. I mean, the monitor, you look at all the parts of it, I guess, but, it's right there in front of the monitor. It's the joystick and the buttons, so you really want to make sure you have that part right. You can also, depending on how you build your control panel, there are games where the control panel is just wood. You can cover it with some sort of Lexan or plexiglass or something. There are ones that were metal that have a sticker over it. So, like I said, all different kinds of way. But the control panel is definitely something that you want to put a little bit of thought into. And by that, I mean, figure out what kind of games you want to play before you just start drilling holes in wood and metal. And by the way, here's a little trivia fact for you. Holes for arcade buttons are 1 1/8 inch around. So if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, they have these drill bits that are they look like they're shaped like not a trident, I guess, almost like a crown, but they're for drilling circles or whatever. But I have two. One is 1 1/8 inch, which is the perfect size for arcade buttons. The other one is 1 1/4 inch, which is the size I needed for joysticks. So there you go. Little trivia fact for you. Now, one thing that a lot of people wonder is, how are you going to connect these joysticks and buttons to the PC that's inside this MAME cabinet running MAME? And actually, there are several different ways to do that, but I will give you my opinion on which is the best. But I'll tell you all of them. So, MAME is programmed to accept input from keyboards. So, the arrow keys on MAME, up, down, left, right, that would control your character, the different buttons, the number keys, insert coins, and start. So, one way that when people began building MAME cabinets, what they did was they took apart keyboards. And they took all the wires, they ran wires from these buttons and joysticks onto the circuit boards from inside keyboards. And so basically, if you think about it, when you hit left on the joystick, left might go to the left arrow key on the keyboard. So this wire, inside underneath the joystick, there's a micro switch. And when you hit left, it goes down, and it basically, the wire touches that contact on the keyboard control panel, and it tells the computer that you've pressed left. So what's good about this solution? What's good about it is, if you have extra keyboards laying around, it's basically free. So if you are on an extreme budget and you like tinkering with projects and soldering and wiring things up and doing all this, then this might be the solution for you. Now, what's bad about this solution? First of all, it's a pain in the butt. You're going to have to take keyboards, pull them apart, do all this thing. But the second and the bigger problem, I guess, with this solution is something that's called keyboard ghosting. And I could go into a long explanation about keyboard ghosting, but basically, by the way that keyboards are wired, they're not wired. If you open up Notepad or whatever, the text editor of your choice, and you press your hands down on all the keys, you'll notice that not all the keys show up. And that's because the way keyboards are wired inside, there's a grid inside your keyboard that detects which key is pressed down. So if you hold down certain keys and then press other keys, because of the way they're wired, it won't recognize all these key presses. So this isn't really a big problem with keyboards, because as human beings and using keyboards as data entry devices, we don't have to hit all 26 or 101 keys all at the same time. And even when playing arcade games, using the arrow keys and the different letters, people have already considered that when they do the layout for these. But the problem becomes when you have a 4-player MAME cabinet, and now you have 4 different people with 4 different joysticks with 6 different buttons. So now we have dozens and dozens of inputs all being put into an arcade game at the same time, and keyboards weren't meant to handle that. So, the easiest and best, and from my point of view, most highly recommended solution is to get a keyboard encoder. Now, what this is a little tiny printed circuit board with a whole bunch of little inputs all the way around the edges where you can put wires into. So, using a flat tip screwdriver, you loosen these little spring-loaded contacts, you put a wire in, and then you screw it back down, and you're done. And on the actual circuit board, it shows you what letters are associated with the little contacts. So these are designed with MAME in mind. So this isn't some like weird, solution of trying to get some other hardware and get it to work. The most popular one for years has been the iPac, and that's I-PAC. The original iPacs supported PS2 keyboards, but the newer ones support USB. So depending on what kind of computer, obviously if you're running, for example, a DOS machine, you may not want to get the USB solution because you'd have to load USB drivers in DOS, which might be difficult. But so what these little encoders do is it's basically the same type of circuitry that's inside a keyboard, except for they've been designed to not have the same issue with the matrix type ghosting. So basically what you would do to wire this up is underneath your control panel where you've added all these buttons and joysticks, every one of these has a little micro switch, and they have 2 leads. So one is going to be for your ground, and the entire control panel will use one common ground. So the ground wire is going to go from button 1 to button 2, button 2 to button 3. It'll go all the way through all your start buttons, through your joysticks, and eventually it will ground to your keyboard encoder, like I said, the iPac. And then all your hot leads off of those micro switches will go to the iPac. So there will be one, and it'll say player, joystick left, joystick right, button 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, player start 1, 2, 3, 4, coin insert player 1, 2, 3, 4. It's very, very easy to wire up. So all your wires go to this little tiny circuit board, and then, like I said, depending on the version that you buy, you either run a PS2 cable from that to the computer, like on the keyboard import, or you run the USB version, so it's just a USB cable that runs from that to the back of the computer. The computer sees it as a keyboard input device. I don't remember. It's been so long since I bought one. I think it may have come with drivers, but I don't really remember needing drivers. There are different versions of the iPac. There's an iPac 2, which has all the contacts you need for a 2-player setup, and then there's an iPac 4, which is for a 4-player setup. So it has enough contacts for 4 players with 4 joysticks, 6 buttons each, plus all the start buttons, all the coin insert buttons, all that stuff. So it's all in one thing. KeyWiz is another competitor to the iPac. Personally, I've used the iPac. That's the first one I got. That was before I think the KeyWiz was out. So I'm not really plugging one over the other. If somebody wants to send me a KeyWiz, I'm in the middle of putting together another MAME cabinet, so I'd be glad to try that. But right now, I'm still an iPac guy. There are also iPacs that will support trackballs and those other things like that too. So, but that's how you wire all that stuff together. So, and like anything else, you may be getting back in that control panel someday. So it's always a good idea to use a little bit of Velcro or wire clamps or whatever. Just try to do a neat wiring job inside there. So you have your keyboard controller. Now you have your control panel, and it's wired up, and it's plugged into your computer. We have our monitor, and we have our computer, and everything is inside of our arcade cabinet. So the final step is making this cabinet look like what you want it to look like. There are several parts to an arcade cabinet. If you don't know, the part up at the top, like that says the game, where it would say Defender or Pac-Man or whatever, that's the marquee. And you can make your own marquee. You can do anything from, you can print out a marquee on your home inkjet printer. It may not look very good. Some people print 2 copies and double layer them. You can go get sheets of very thin plexiglass and sandwich your marquee in between two sheets of plexiglass and put them on an arcade machine like that. Or you can take it to a local printer and have it printed out on, heavier paper, things like that. You can have it printed out on vinyl. You probably don't want to use anything too thick so that if you put a light behind it, it will shine through still. But that's the marquee. And then the part that goes around your monitor, that's known as the bezel. The bezel can be anything from plain black to a color to something that has artwork. A lot of times older machines had instructions for that specific game, so you may want to explain what the buttons are on your particular MAME machine. The simplest way to do a bezel is if you put plexiglass over the front of the monitor, you could just tape off the area where the monitor shows through and then spray paint the rest black. That's one solution. I've used poster board on them before. You could use anything. So, but you definitely want to put a bezel around the monitor so that you can't see inside the arcade cabinet or possibly through it. And then, like we talked about, there's for the control panel, you may have control panel artwork. That's sometimes referred to as a control panel overlay or a CPO. That, again, can be machine specific or just a simple design, or it may just be a single color. That's okay. And then the last thing would be the side art. And again, you can have these printed out at local vinyl shops, or you can order them online if you just want a generic one that says MAME. For me, I've done several different kinds of MAME machines. I've built, I referred to the one out of the Donkey Kong machine. I have one in my garage right now. It's kind of an ongoing project that I inherited, and it's just so big that it's hard to find a place to put it in the house, but it's one of these that just has a control panel that goes on for days, so I'm not really in love with it right now. But what I'm wanting to do, and I think some of the best MAME machines are ones that are original. And I'm going to link to a couple of just great examples. There's one that I remember seeing that's all black and hot pink. And I think the guy built it maybe for his daughter. But inside, there's parts of the cabinet that are cut out with plexiglass that have pink neon that show through. I've seen cabinets that have custom lights, custom speakers, So for me, it's a balance between having it look original but not gaudy, and wanting to stay off of that crap MAME page or anything like that. Because there are some terrible, terrible MAME machines out there. There are sometimes I think I'm one of these people sometimes too, where you come up with something in your head and you think it would look good, and then whenever you start putting it together, it doesn't look good. I remember seeing on that crap MAME page, there's one. Where someone made their MAME cabinet, and the whole side is just decorated with cutouts of arcade figures. That sounds like something that might be a good idea when you think about it, but then when you actually look at this machine, it looks like newspaper clippings that someone has stuck using a magnet to the front of their refrigerator. It doesn't look good. So, part of it is just. And one thing that you could do, and I've done this before, is take a picture of a blank cabinet and then throw it into Photoshop or whatever video or photo editing software that you use, and play around with it. Put some different designs on there. See different colors. See what things look good. That's one of the cool things about that software. You can play around in the computer. It doesn't cost you any money to do that. So now with everything inside the MAME cabinet, you're going to need what is known as a front end. The front end is a piece of software that basically controls MAME. Now, MAME is a computer program, and it is designed for you to navigate using a mouse or a keyboard. And obviously, those are things that you don't want to have to use in an arcade cabinet. You want to be able to navigate and pick the games that you want to play using a joystick. So there are several different front ends. All you got to do, go out to Google and type in MAME front ends, and you'll find a million of them. They're different front ends specialize in different things. There's one called Arcade OS, which is very good if you're using an arcade monitor because it's very low resolution. It doesn't have a lot of small text. There's one called Game Launcher, which is nice. There's a very popular one called MAME, which works both with Linux and with Windows. I believe that I've read a thread recently that people are having difficulty getting it to work with Windows 7, but if you're still running XP on your main machine or anything like that, it works good. I personally use one called Maximus Arcade. Some of these front ends are free, some of them are not free. Maximus is one that is not free. If I remember right, I think I paid like $20, $25 or something for it, but I really like the way it's set up. It's very easy to set up. I also experimented with writing my own front end, which ran in Visual Basic, and I found out it's a lot harder to set one up than you would think. Another thing that these front ends give you is the ability to run other programs, not just MAME. So, for example, there is another emulator called Daphne, which Daphne, you may remember, is the name of the princess that you're trying to save in Dragon's Lair. And Daphne is an emulator that plays Laserdisc games. So, and this, I mentioned this earlier in the program about needing drive space. Well, Laserdisc images of arcade games can be pretty big. So if you're going to support all the Laserdisc games on your MAME cabinet, like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace and Mad Dog McCree and all these old classic games like that, you're going to need some drive space. But it is nice to use a front end to be able to load other emulators. Now, at work we have something called scope. So every project has a scope. And we also have what is called scope creep. Or scope crawl, and that is when the scope of a project begins to grow, and you have things that are outside the scope. So it's very easy, once you find a front end that will load anything, to put every kind of emulator you can think of in there. People have MAME machines that will launch Atari 2600 emulators, and they can play Atari 2600 games. And that's, again, I've said it several times, it comes back to personal preference. So if you want a machine that runs every kind of emulator, then, that's great. There's a couple of issues you may run into. One is that some of those emulators require button key presses. So you may have to go in and do some advanced configuration, either on the emulator or on the front end that you're using, to get the emulator to work with only the buttons and joysticks that you have available on your control panel. The other issue, and this is my personal issue, is that there never were Atari 2600s available in arcade machines. So that's not what I'm trying to do with a MAME machine. With a MAME machine, for me, it's to simulate the experience of playing arcade games in an arcade cabinet. So, I didn't have, there were, I guess, if you want to get technical, Super Nintendo arcade cabinets, but, like when I first got my front end set up, Maximus, when I found you could load any kind of arcade game or any kind of emulator, the first one I put in was a Commodore 64. Well, first of all, Commodore 64 doesn't really lend itself to that environment because a lot of games you had to press F1, F3, F5, or F7 to start or configure the game. Well, those by default aren't, MAME key presses that are mapped to buttons. So I had to do some custom work there. And even, it's easy to forget about things. Like you'll be playing a game and then it'll say, well, press a space bar to continue. Well, there's no space bar on a joystick and button. So it is an option. And if it's something you want to set up, then there are front ends out there that will support that. Another cool thing about front ends is many of the front ends will display artwork, graphics, videos as you're going through your MAME list. And one other thing that front ends really help you with is organizing your games. Now, remember when I said that MAME it supports well over 5,000 games now? That's a lot of games. So when you fire up MAME and it starts displaying these games alphabetically, it may take you a long time to get to the M's or the N's and the O's. If you want to play track and field, you may have to scroll for a long time. So one thing that MAME supports this, and many front ends support this as well, is different genres. So you can group all your games together, like all the fighting games, all the driving games, all the space games. You can group those things together. Now, one thing I like about Maximus Arcade, and I'm not plugging them necessarily because a lot of the other ones have this same feature, but it's just the one I'm familiar with, is they have a section where you can also put your favorite games. So, like I said, if there's 5,000 games, you can bet that people haven't heard of probably at least 4,000 of them, maybe more than that. So when you can go in and put your favorites, that's where I put all the classics. That's where I have Dig Dug and Pac-Man and Yi Are Kung Fu and Shinobi and all my favorite games. They go into that little favorite section, so you can flip over to the favorites tab and have it narrowed down to maybe the 50 or 100 games that you play the most. So that's really convenient. So as far as MAME cabinets go, and that's basically it, I can't stress enough that, number one, there are going to be people lined up telling you that whatever you have chosen to do it the wrong way. No matter what decisions you make when you're putting together a MAME cabinet, there are people that are not going to agree with that. And that's fine. That's their prerogative. They can build a MAME cabinet in their own way. Some people don't agree with MAME cabinets at all. There's a huge section of the arcade community that hates MAME cabinets and hates emulation, especially when they see people taking classic arcade cabinets and converting them to MAME machines. So, that's their prerogative, and personally, I believe in both. I had classic arcade games. I have classic arcade machines in my garage, but I also have MAME machines, and I have multi-type machines as well. So they're not 100% authentic, but they have their place, just like emulation has its place. So, but that's, I guess, something to keep in mind. I'd also say, again, plan out what you're going to do. Don't just go buy a bunch of wood and start cutting and then hope something good comes together, because that will be known as your first MAME machine. And then once you find all the errors, you're going to, build another one and do it right. So come up with a theme. That's what I think is cool. Maybe it's your personal fighting machine, or maybe it's, what I really want to build next is a MAME cabinet, that has like flame job coming up the side, like a real classic hot rod looking machine that's black with flames coming up on the side, and maybe like, blue pinstripe around the flames and some blue and orange buttons, something like that. So it's really about, like I said, just coming up with something that fits your personality. If you need help, find somebody that's good at woodworking. The electronic part is really pretty easy. Hooking up the front end and all that, I mean, it may take some trial and effort, but it's not really difficult stuff. The woodworking is something that, like I said, if you don't have skills in, find people that will help you sand down an old machine or spray paint a machine. This is a good springtime project. We got spring coming up. Go to your local arcade. Go find an auction. Go find a dead machine in Craigslist or somewhere that you could get for $25 or $50, and sand that thing down. Spray paint it the way you want it painted. Put paint for Micron or whatever you want to do. Have custom graphics. It's really, like I said, it's just your imagination, whatever you want to do with that cabinet. So, now, where can you find resources online for MAME cabinets? And I mean, the first one's obviously Google. If you go type in Google MAME cabinet plans, you'll get millions of hits, literally millions at this point. So many people have built MAME cabinets, and you won't find any two that are alike. Everybody has, put their own little twist on it. They do things their own way. One of the big communities dedicated to MAME cabinets is BYOAC, which I have a hat. I bought, I was part of they had a fundraiser type thing where people pitched in and bought hats. And it was for build your own arcade controls, BYOAC. And every time I wear it, people ask. The front of the hat has a Player 1 start button on the front. And one side of it says Flack, and the other side says BYOAC. And everybody who sees that hat asks me, why would I wear a hat that says bring your own air conditioning? But it's not. It's build your own arcade controls, BYOAC. And now they have actually, years ago actually, they changed their name to the Arcade Controls website, and that's just arcadecontrols.com. They have a wiki online. They have forums and they have a main page, but they also have a wiki that goes through every part of building a MAME cabinet. So if you want to find out about different kinds of control panels, different types of keyboard encoders, different ways to have side art printed, any questions you could possibly have about building an arcade cabinet, they have answered on their wiki. So that is a super good resource. One other resource is obviously Invading Spaces, a beginner's guide to collecting arcade games, which also happen to be written by me. It's available at robohara.com/invading spaces, all one word. And you can buy the PDF for only $2.99. That is DRM free, or you can buy a paperback copy and have it shipped anywhere in the U.S. for $20. So I might be a little partial, but that's also another good resource if you're looking for one on MAME cabinets. I think that's about a wrap for episode 122 on MAME cabinets. I would love to hear your feedback. If you have any MAME cabinet tips that I skipped over or didn't mention, anything you want to talk about, if you've ever built a MAME cabinet or if you're thinking about building a MAME cabinet, drop me an email. It's robohara@robohara.com, or you can call the voicemail box at area code 206-309-9501. Call that number, leave me a message. If it's great, I'll play it on the air. If it makes me cry, I will talk about it to no end. I don't know. Don't leave me messages that make me cry. But seriously, if you do have any feedback, suggestions, criticisms, anything like that, that's two ways to get a hold of me. Again, I'd like to thank all the new affiliates that we gained over the last couple of weeks. Stitcher, all our new Stitcher listeners, all the new listeners we have out there at the Xbox Marketplace, the Zune guys, the Double Twist, Podcast Pickle, everybody out there. If there's another place you would like to see the show added, again, get a hold of me and let me know. I'd be glad to get the show anywhere we can out there. Also, extra special thanks to Brett Weiss for being the show's first sponsor. Again, Brett's website is brettweisswords.com. You'll find a link for that over at the podcast website. Be sure to check out Brett's books. They're really awesome. I have the first 3, and they're great reference material. They're great reading material if you like looking through collections of old video games, cartridges, all that kind of stuff. It's really good stuff to go through. So thank you for listening. Thanks everybody for making You Don't Know Flack such a success. And I will see you next Sunday on episode 123 of You Don't Know Flack.